They say that the mountains remember. That the soil here keeps secrets, pressed deep between the roots and the bones. If you listen closely, on a windless night, when the stars seem too still, you can almost hear the land whispering names that no one dares to speak anymore. Names like Whitaker. Names that have been erased from records, crossed out in courthouse ledgers, and yet, still live on in the blood of those who never left these hills. Our story begins in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky, where the roads twist like veins through forest and fog. It's a place where isolation wasn't just a fact of geography, it was a way of life. Here, family meant survival. The world outside was cruel, unpredictable, and filled with strangers who didn't understand mountain ways. So the people turned inward. They trusted only their own. And over time, their family trees didn't branch out, they curled in on themselves. The Whitaker clan lived at the end of a dirt path, miles from the nearest paved road. Generations had been born and buried on the same patch of land. Their cabins rotted from the inside out, patched together with tin, memory, and desperation. The old folks used to say that if you looked hard enough, you could still see the footprints of the first Whitaker settlers, etched into the mud, leading up the holler, never leaving it again. They were proud, hard people. But poverty changes pride into something else, something quieter, more desperate. By the time the Great Depression hit, many families in these mountains were already starving. Roads were impassable. Schools were few. And the nearest doctor could be days away. So the Whitakers did what they had always done, they stayed together. They trusted blood over all else. And that was where the trouble began. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. Brothers and sisters shared children who would never know their true parentage. At first, the community didn't talk about it. They said it wasn't their business. But word travels in small towns like rot beneath the floorboards. People started to notice things. The way the children spoke in sounds instead of words. The way their eyes never met yours. The way some of them moved, twitching, uneasy, as if some part of them was trapped between human and something else. There are no official records of how it started. No priest ever married them. No doctor ever delivered their babies. But the pattern is there, if you know where to look. Marriage licenses between cousins filed under different spellings. Birth certificates listing fathers as unknown. Tombstones with no dates. The family line turned inward, folding tighter with each generation, until the blood itself became a closed loop. What's left today isn't just a family, it's a living memory of what happens when isolation becomes destiny. Reporters who have dared to visit the Whitakers describe it like stepping into another world. A world forgotten by time, hidden behind trees and whispers. The people there rarely speak. Their faces, their gestures, they seem to carry the weight of generations of silence. As if they're aware that their existence is both a curiosity and a curse. But before we judge them, we have to ask how they got here. Because the truth is, the Whitakers didn't choose this. It was chosen for them, by poverty, by geography, by the long shadow of history that America likes to ignore. These hills were once home to miners and farmers, men who broke their backs for coal and came home with lungs full of dust. Their sons had no schools, no money, and no way out. And so the world outside forgot them. Until someone came looking, not for justice, not for help, but for a story. A story like this one. When filmmaker Mark Lyda first made his way into the Appalachian Holler where the Whitakers lived, he described the silence as unnatural. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of rust and damp wood. The dogs barked before he even reached the gate, their cries echoing off the hills. He didn't knock, there was no door to knock on. Just a sagging frame, half covered by a blue tarp. What he found inside would haunt him for years. 3 generations of Whitakers lived there together, bound not just by blood, but by a shared detachment from the world beyond the ridge. Their eyes followed him, not with fear, but with something older, an awareness that they had been seen before, judged before, and would be again. Lyda said that when he tried to ask them about their family, about their history, the answers came in grunts, in gestures, in sounds that weren't quite words. It wasn't just that they couldn't speak. It was as though language itself had been lost, swallowed by the years of isolation that shaped them. He took photographs, yes. But what those images captured was more than faces. They were echoes of a forgotten America, a reminder that civilization has edges, and that beyond those edges, life doesn't stop. It twists. It adapts. It survives in ways we don't want to understand. There's something almost biblical about it. Generations punishing the next without knowing it. The sins of the fathers carved into the bones of their children. You can see it in their eyes, the vacant stare that isn't just ignorance, but inheritance. Scientists have a name for it, inbreeding depression. A biological collapse, when too much of the same bloodline turns inward and starts to fail. But to those who lived it, it wasn't science. It was family. It was all they had left. Imagine a life where the only people you know, love, and trust are your own blood. Imagine the world outside as an enemy, a threat, a story told by strangers who've never set foot on your dirt. In that kind of world, love becomes necessity. And necessity becomes curse. By the time outsiders came to document them, the Whitakers were more myth than family. A ghost story told by locals to scare the curious away. Some said the clan was cursed, that generations ago a Whitaker broke a sacred promise, to the church, to God, to the land itself, and that the family had been paying for it ever since. Others said it wasn't a curse at all, but consequence. A mirror held up to a nation that pretends its forgotten people don't exist. Because the truth is, the Whitakers aren't an anomaly. They're a symptom. There are other families like them scattered across the Appalachian Range, isolated, impoverished, and invisible. Families whose bloodlines loop back on themselves, whose family trees are shaped less like branches, and more like circles. When you stand in front of the Whitakers' home, you feel it. The weight of years. The silence that isn't just quiet, but mournful. You realize that this isn't a horror story about monsters, it's a tragedy about people. People who were left behind long enough that the line between choice and fate disappeared. And maybe that's the real horror. That somewhere, deep in the hills of America, there are still families living like this. Forgotten. Fused by blood. Waiting for someone to remember that they're still here. The deeper you look into the Whitaker story, the more the line between myth and truth begins to blur. Every whisper, every rumor, every photograph feels like a clue in a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. Because this isn't just about one family, it's about what happens when generations of silence become a form of inheritance. When pain is passed down like land. When the roots grow too deep to be pulled out. The earliest trace of the Whitakers appears in records from the late 1800s. Census takers listed them as farmers, though most couldn't read or write. Their neighbors were few. They built their own homes from timber they felled themselves, worked the same soil year after year, and buried their dead behind the house, unmarked, uncounted, unremembered. If you compare those early census pages, you'll notice something strange. The same names repeating every decade. The same first names. The same last names. Over and over. As though time itself had stopped turning in that hollow. By the mid-20th century, the family line had become so entangled that outsiders couldn't untangle it. No one knew who was who anymore. Birth records blurred, marriages unregistered. Children raised by grandparents who might also have been their cousins. The result wasn't just physical deformity or speech impairment, it was something deeper, something harder to see. A quiet breaking of identity. When everyone is related to everyone else, who are you, really? Where does the self end and the family begin? People in nearby towns told stories about the Whitakers in hushed tones. They'd warn travelers not to go up that road. "Ain't nothing good up there," they'd say. That family's touched. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and once word began to spread about the clan living in the backwoods, about the barking, the strange noises, the stares that could pierce through you like glass, curiosity turned to obsession. The Whitakers became a spectacle, a living relic of something primal that civilization had left behind. People came to stare. To photograph. To prove the stories were real. And yet, every image only deepened the mystery. Because what you see in their faces isn't evil. It isn't madness. It's sorrow. It's the haunting stillness of lives lived without witness. No schools. No doctors. No churches. No laws. Just family. Generation after generation, circling back through the same narrow bloodline, until memory itself began to decay. When Mark Leiter returned to visit the family again years later, he found them living much as they always had, off the grid, untouched by modernity. The old house still stood, collapsing under its own weight, surrounded by debris and silence. He brought them food, clothing, and money, trying to offer something more than a camera lens. But even his kindness couldn't undo the centuries of isolation that had already shaped them. They accepted his gifts with gratitude, but also with confusion. The outside world wasn't built for them. It never had been. It's easy to look at them and feel pity, or revulsion, or fascination. But all of those feelings reveal more about us than about them. Because the truth is, the Whitakers didn't start this story, they inherited it. They were born into a place that was already cut off, into a lineage already looping. Poverty became tradition. Ignorance became inheritance. And isolation became identity. You can almost trace the progression through their DNA. Scientists have studied what happens to isolated populations over long stretches of time. The gene pool narrows. Recessive traits, normally buried deep, begin to surface. Disorders of the mind, of the body. Faces change. Voices falter. The blood remembers, even when the people don't. And yet, there's something even darker than the biology of it. Something psychological. When everyone you know is kin, when your world ends at the tree line, the concept of normal dissolves. There is no taboo when there's no outside world to define it. Generations of Whitakers lived and died without ever questioning what the rest of us would call unthinkable. In their world, it wasn't sin, it was survival. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, loyal to the only life you've ever known? Or would you have broken the chain, even if it meant leaving everything behind? When we talk about inbreeding, we often think of royalty, European dynasties keeping their power pure. But in places like rural Kentucky, it wasn't about power. It was about proximity. Families married within themselves not out of pride, but out of necessity. The roads were few, the communities smaller still. To marry outside the family meant crossing mountains, facing suspicion, and risking survival. So the Whitakers did what they had to. And in doing so, they created a legacy that would one day be seen as monstrous. Some locals say that, late at night, you can still see a light flickering in the old Whitaker home. A lantern swinging in the dark. Maybe it's nothing more than a trick of the eyes, a reflection, a story to scare the kids. But maybe, it's something else. Maybe the land itself remembers what happened there. Maybe the earth keeps record of every name, every life, every echo that was lost to silence. Because this isn't just about a single family. It's about what America forgets. The parts of the country left behind after the mines closed, after the railroads left, after the world decided that poverty was something you could hide. The Whitakers are a living reminder that you can bury people in the mountains, but you can't bury history. Not really. And when you see them, when you look at their photographs and feel that chill, that strange unease, you're not looking at monsters. You're looking at what happens when the world stops looking back. You're looking at a mirror, clouded with generations of dust. What's left of the Whitakers today are fragments. Some have passed. Others live quietly, avoiding the cameras now. The children are grown. The holler still stands, though nature has started to reclaim it, trees creeping through windows, vines twisting around doorframes. The land is taking back what was always its own. And yet, if you walk far enough into those woods, you can still feel it, the presence, the weight, the quiet ache of forgotten lives watching you from the trees. Sometimes, the past doesn't die. It just waits. That there's a point in every story where you realize the horror isn't in what you see, but in what you understand too late. For the Whitakers, that point came when the world found them again. Cameras, documentaries, strangers driving miles up dirt roads just to stare through their windows. The family that once lived unseen became a spectacle. Their faces were posted online, their lives dissected, their pain turned into curiosity. And in a cruel way, that was the second tragedy, because even when the world finally looked at them, it still didn't see them. They became symbols. Symbols of inbreeding, of rural decay, of the forgotten poor. But symbols can't feel. People can. And the truth behind those eyes, the vacant, unsettled stares caught on film, isn't madness. It's exhaustion. The exhaustion of generations carrying the same burden, being trapped between shame and survival. It's easy to forget that every story like this has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But with the Whitakers, the end feels uncertain, unfinished. You can't untangle what's been twisted for over a century. You can't heal a wound that was never allowed to close. You can only watch as time does what it always does, slowly, quietly, erasing everything. Mark Lyda once said that he felt conflicted filming them. That what he captured was both tragic and necessary. Because if the world didn't see them, they would vanish completely. But if the world did see them, they would become prisoners of that gaze. And maybe that's the cruelest part, to be invisible for so long, and then remembered only as a warning. Some say the Whitaker family is a portrait of what isolation does to the human soul. But others see something else, an indictment. A reminder that America creates its own ghosts. We built roads that stopped just short of their hollow. We built systems that never reached their schools. We built an economy that took everything from their grandparents and offered nothing back. And then, when what was left no longer resembled us, we called it horror. But look closer, and you realize the horror isn't them. It's us. It's what we allowed to grow in the cracks between progress and neglect. The Whitakers are not an accident, they are an inheritance of abandonment. They are what happens when poverty is passed down like a surname. You can't talk about them without talking about the land. Appalachia is more than mountains, it's memory. It's the echo of coal dust in the lungs, of prayers unanswered in empty churches, of families too proud to leave and too poor to stay. The soil there doesn't forget. It holds every story like a grave, and the Whitakers' story is carved deepest of all. People who've walked that hollow say the silence feels alive. That even the wind seems to hesitate before crossing the ridge. There's a stillness there that doesn't belong to the present. A weight that presses on your chest as though the earth itself is remembering everything you wish it wouldn't. The broken toys in the yard, the rusted truck that hasn't moved in decades, the faint smell of smoke from a wood stove that's been burning since before you were born, it all speaks to a world that time decided to leave behind. And yet, despite everything, the Whitakers endure. They wake with the sun. They tend to what little they have. They sit on their porch in silence, side by side, the way their ancestors did before them. There's a strange kind of peace in that. A resignation that borders on grace. They don't curse their bloodline. They don't question their fate. They just are. Like the land itself, scarred, still standing, and older than judgment. When outsiders call them the most inbred family in America, they flatten generations into a label. But what that label hides is pain, and history. Every strange quirk of speech, every vacant look, every fragment of a name mumbled through the years, it all tells a story of human beings who were simply forgotten. They didn't choose to be part of an experiment in isolation. They didn't choose to become a reflection of genetic consequence. They just didn't leave. And the world didn't come for them. There's something deeply unsettling about that. Because it forces us to confront the question we spend our whole lives avoiding: what happens to people when no one remembers them? When no one checks, or calls, or cares? What happens when family becomes the only law that remains? The Whitakers' story isn't over. It can't be. The bloodline continues, though thinner now, more fragile. The younger generations, those few who've left the mountains, carry the memory like a shadow. Some refuse to speak the family name. Others try to reclaim it, to tell the truth on their own terms. But no matter how far they go, the hills still call. The past still follows. If you drive through the hollers of West Virginia, of eastern Kentucky, of southern Ohio, you'll see other houses like theirs. Rusted tin roofs. Overgrown porches. A single light flickering behind dirty glass. Families still holding on, still forgotten. Maybe not Whitakers, but close. Maybe not cursed, but marked. The quiet ones history forgot to write about. The ones who live just outside the maps, in places where roads fade into dirt and names fade into whispers. And when the day comes that the last of the Whitakers is gone, the world will move on again. The story will fade back into rumor, into myth. The photographs will circulate online, stripped of context, shared by strangers who will never know their names. And the mountains will remain. Silent. Watching. Waiting for the next family the world decides not to see. Because that's what the mountains do. They remember. They remember every sin, every silence, every secret buried in their soil. The Whitakers are just one chapter in that book, a book written not in ink, but in blood. When you think about them, don't think of monsters. Think of mirrors. Think of what happens when people are left behind long enough that they stop belonging anywhere. Think of the quiet horror of being alive, but forgotten. And the next time someone tells you that the past is dead, remember the Whitakers. Remember the holler. Remember that beneath the beauty of those Appalachian hills lies a story older than the country itself. A story of love turned inward, of blood that refused to thin, of a family that became a living monument to what happens when the world stops watching. Because even now, even as we speak, the mountains are listening. And they never forget.